crisis. Fantastic later went on to clarify that the disappearance of the Steam page was in fact a complex legal matter relating to their use of the trademark the day before. This trademark was already in use for multiple years by a South Korean citizen who used it on a calendar app. This individual had since filed copyright takedown requests with Steam to have the game blocked, believing that they were misusing his trademark in their product and seeking a legal resolution to the matter. Fantastic declared in their communication that they were only made aware of the situation on January 19th, days prior to Valve's compliance with the takedown requests. But upon inspection of publicly available legal records and documents, this was at best an oversight, perhaps a misrepresentation, or at worst an outright lie. This information was brought to light by Force Gaming, who discovered the trademark record showed that at the time of publishing the day before trailer in January of 2021, Fantastic had not even applied for the trademark. In fact, they never filed official paperwork until January of 2022, a whole year later. According to those same records, Fantastic was made aware of the conflict in November of 2022, meaning they knew their game name was likely to be a point of legal contention 3 months prior to the Steam page vanishing. Not just that, but anyone who has dealt with legal matters will no doubt know there is almost always a letter of intent or notice before any legal process is declared, making it unrealistic to assume Fantastic had only found out about the takedown notices being a threat merely days before they were actually sent to Valve and the Steam page removed. Even if that were the case, they would have known over 2 months earlier that their trademark was rejected due to their failure to dispute the South Koreans' own claim. Raising yet another question: how could they be so incompetent as to neglect a trademark for 2 years at every step of the way? Regardless of this, what became clear is that Fantastic's game was in a legal battle for their very name. The result was multiple of their YouTube videos being removed, the day before Steam page being removed, and months, potentially years of legal fees ahead of them before the name could be used again, if it ever could. The legal battle then began in Korea, where Minesweeper, the parent company, disputed the application of the calendar app's name in regard to an unrelated product such as a video game. Along with this came yet more bad news for the day before fans, another delay, this time moving the date from March 1st, 2023 to an even less certain date of November 2023. After all, no one can put a time frame in a civil legal matter, especially when it spans multiple continents, and 8 months seemed overly optimistic. All in all, the day before seemed to now be going to the stages of parody, stranger than fiction, and impossible to make up. Every step of the way, if it could go wrong, it would, not due to unfortunate circumstance, but of their own making, essentially snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, managing to always place themselves in the right place at the right time, but being completely incapable of capitalizing on their chances. At this time, people were so jaded by the day before, expecting that everything they said or did was a lie, that this legal matter was even considered as a conspiracy. Some believed the copyright issue was simply fabrication. When pointed out that there was real legal action being taken that would cost tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, the narrative shifted. A simple agreement between parties, expend money for a real legal battle, but both parties be in on it from the start. Which raises the question, why did people think this was the case? And some truly believed it was to give Fantastic another perfect excuse to delay the game, one that no one could argue with as it was simply out of their hands as a matter of law. Possibly to even cancel the game and avoid launching and potentially being sued for real by the customers. Of course, conspiracies are usually sexy, reality is often boring. This situation could simply be explained by Hanlon's razor, never attribute to malice, that which is adequately explained by stupidity, and Fantastic was to date defined by exactly that, stupidity. This situation alone would have been crippling news for any company and their fans, but for Fantastic it was just another day, and also the beginning of much bigger issues. They released a new gameplay trailer on February 3rd, and this was seen as yet more vindication for those who accused the day before and Fantastic of theft. This time, it had real merit. Unlike the previous accusations with the Division's art assets, and more like the Last of Us logo, they had shot for shot copied the trailer from Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War Zombies. You can look at them side by side here, and you will see that this is an identical recreation. They wasn't simply using the trailer of somebody else, they were just recreating it with their own assets. Which again, is why people started to immediately take everything they'd done before, and started to compare that to other games too, which showed that, yes, this was really happening with a frequency that was impossible to ignore. And again, to be clear, it wasn't that they were literally taking assets from other companies, they were simply creating an exact replica, for seemingly no reason at all, besides being devoid of their own creativity. A situation that was inexplicable. After all, how could you know the internet is calling you a thief for stealing a logo for 2 years at this stage, and yet brazenly shot-for-shot copy another incredibly popular game's trailer? They had to know, so to this day it remains beyond comprehension as to why they would do this. Were they purposefully creating controversy just to remain relevant? Maybe that's the answer, but what we do know is that they did it and never addressed why. Instead, they fought back against the critics, releasing a statement that still exists on their Twitter feed. We all live in a time of disinformation and lack of fact-checking. Anyone can say anything for views, and everyone will believe it. Disinformation needs to be dealt with, as it can harm not only us, but also other indie and small/medium studios. It also has a mental impact on the members of such teams. After the release of the day before, we'll think about how to help novice developers deal with fakes and allocate resources for this. Destroying is easy, creating is difficult. A very powerful statement to be sure, one that clearly addresses YouTubers such as myself, who to this point had only really given opinions on what had happened and speculating as to why it had happened. This statement could have aged very well if everyone had been wrong about the day before. The game could have released, and then they could have revisited their words here, pointing out how quickly the so-called hate mob jumped on their small studio, trying to destroy their beloved game. But you should return to this statement later to read it with the retrospect of what really happened instead. Until then, things continued to get worse. As Fantastic addressed disinformation from people they said would do anything for views, the next part of the story came from a place they would struggle to argue against: their own employees. On February 13th, a Russian publication posted an interview with insider sources at Fantastic. This interview discussed in detail the internal struggle of the studio, as well as the state of their flagship game the day before. And if you thought things were bad from the public perspective, well, things inside Fantastic were much, much worse. The source describes an incredibly toxic working environment, including mandatory crunch, referring to long work hours to try and meet deadlines, which led to a high turnover rate of staff, with people opting to simply leave the studio rather than continue in such a toxic environment. The article goes on to state the conspiracy theory about the trademark issue was incorrect. There was no agreement. It was a real legal dispute. They also clarified it was just another sign of what they call incompetence of the top of Fantastic in all aspects, which makes total sense. People were assuming that the higher-ups of Fantastic were some kind of evil masterminds coming up with grand strategies, when the truth was they were just really bad at managing their business, which is admittedly much less sexy of a storyline. The article goes on to say that the brothers who oversaw the studio and often displayed in the videos of the day before were everything that is wrong with the development, that they are terrible to work with, shouting, screaming, cursing at employees, changing development decisions direction on a whim almost daily. The studio was rotten at the very core, and these men were the ones responsible. They also go on to describe what many had speculated regarding early trailers of the day before, that they were simply vertical slices, and that most, if not all of the features on display simply did not function in any real game. Just a hype trailer created in a small area designed to market the product. The interview ended, echoing the same sentiment that many of us have been sharing now for 2 years. I strongly do not recommend buying this. Now this is where my previous video on the day before ended. It was a deep dive on the whole saga, with months still left to launch, and with many questions that needed answers. Many of you will be aware of much of the story to this stage, but there has so much happened since then, and the story is so compelling, that I believe it needed to be available all in one place, with as much detail as possible. I truly believe this is one of the strangest video game development stories ever, and wanted to do it justice as such. And if you thought the ride until now was bumpy, well, buckle up, and I hope you didn't pick a window seat, because this is where it really goes off the rails. So some of the questions that were still being asked, even though everyone should have known better: will the game ever release? Was any of it real? Did they really do all of this for a Kickstarter on another game in a silly app? Are the investors really being scammed? And what's going to happen next? Well, very little, actually, at least for a few months. There were a few teaser images posted, nothing of substance. There was one video, which was their attempt to prove to the world everything was legit, that all the criticism and haters were wrong. Though all this video did was illustrate that at one time, they had a much more original, charming, and real-looking video game, before they decided to change it up and go for a hyper-realistic, almost Division 2 clone. Many consider the original models and art direction to be an upgrade on what it became, especially considering people had already put together comparison videos of the graphical downgrade of the day before from that initial trailer release in January 2021 until now. By this point in mid-2023, the game was almost unrecognizable, which, spoiler alert, is going to get much worse a little later in the story. On top of that, there was a very weird obsession from Fantastic with pictures of hot tubs and cars within the game. They posted multiple teasers of these, including a sports car driving through an alleged zombie-filled city, but in true the day before fashion, mysteriously, it was totally devoid of zombies, or players for that matter, yet again displaying footage that they spent time and money to create, without any real purpose or result, except for confusing onlookers. Next came a quote from Fantastic Twitter, which appeared deceptively written or conveniently placed to appear as if it was a games journalist talking about the day before. The truth is that it was quoting themselves, saying, "The day before will be at the top of Steam wish lists again soon." So to take the temperature again, the day before was at this time considered by almost everyone to be a scam for one reason or another. There was no way you could go and see a mention of this game without that being the prevailing sentiment. You've heard and seen why people were feeling this way throughout, but as a reminder, one of the biggest criticisms was that no one had ever played the game or seen anyone really playing it. There was only incredibly curated trailers that felt totally off. This situation could very easily have been remedied by the developers if they cared. And to be clear, Fantastic owed the public nothing. No explanation, no apology, no gameplay, no access, and no game at the end of it all. After all, nobody had paid a cent. This would of course be against their interest as a business, since proving themselves real and the game good would have renewed a massive wave of hype for a game that clearly people were interested in, but they did owe them nothing. If they felt that they were wrongly accused, but happy to let the finished product speak for itself upon launch, they didn't even need to produce proof or let people see behind the curtain until it was ready. That would answer all the questions. But clearly Fantastic did want to prove themselves prior to that day, or at least they wanted to appear to do so. So they took to Discord to make a surprise announcement. This one could shut down the haters for good. A notification went out to the whole server, tens of thousands of users. The day before is coming to beta, and you can finally play it. The wait is almost over. You will see what we've made, and know that you were wrong for doubting. They also said that the test would give an opportunity for players to provide valuable feedback, which could improve the final product. This was a huge win for the people who still believed in the day before. A dwindling number of people, for sure, but one that could easily swell once again, especially if the developers were finally confident enough to put their game in the hands of a single living human. This announcement was not alone. They also parroted these talking points in a few interviews over the coming weeks with numerous press outlets. And to be clear, this was totally unprompted. Fantastic had gone out of their own way to announce and advertise this beta, raising the question, would they really be doing this if the game was fake or they wasn't ready? Not just that, but they also discussed plans for launch, which was getting dangerously close. Specifically plans for console launch and whether the game would go into Steam's early access. Now to this point, across multiple years of communication and trailers, early access was never discussed, leading the public to believe the game would be a full release on day one, which is why it wasn't surprising when Fantastic employee being interviewed also confirmed that they, quote, are not considering early access release. We are planning to conduct a closed beta phase prior to the game's launch. Why am I mentioning this? Well, remember those 2 points for a little later. They become incredibly relevant very soon. After this, things were mostly quiet as people waited for whatever disaster would come next. But for once, in the history of the day before, this time it was good news. In late August, I published a video detailing my telling Fantastic and the day before's victory in their Korean legal dispute. To cut a long and rather complicated story short, 2 legal cases existed. One in the United States that needs to happen to fight the DMCA that was issued to their Steam page, and one in Korea to address the trademark's origin. The United States case was on hold pending resolution of the Korean case, which had now concluded in favor of Fantastic. The Korean authorities stripped the original owner of their trademark as it relates to video games, effectively ending the dispute entirely. This would now allow for the United States case to dissolve in short order, as many countries have an agreement when it comes to upholding trademarks or copyright. So winning Korea essentially means a win in every other jurisdiction in said agreement. Despite this victory, my Toner and Fantastic had now filed a new trademark called Dayworld, which was clearly a placeholder name in case the United States situation didn't resolve in time for their impending launch in just over a month's time. Luckily, it was never needed. Unluckily, this victory was short-lived as things went right back to regularly scheduled programming just 1 month later. On October 30th, Fantastic began their marketing campaign for the day before's launch, which started with what they called the final trailer going live on November 1st. The timing made sense, since this was just 9 days prior to when they'd scheduled the launch date. There was just one problem, however. 9 days until launch, where was the beta that they promised? Regardless, people tuned in as the trailer launched and were unsurprised to see nothing really of substance that they hadn't seen for the last 2 years of coverage. Other than the fact that the game looked worse than each time before, there were still many questions, but at least it would all be answered soon. Not as soon as scheduled, as the trailer also delayed the game for another month until December 7th instead. The only other surprise was that suddenly, the game was now being advertised as launching not as a full product, instead as an early access title, something that came from nowhere. After all, if you follow the timeline, they believed this game was ready to launch 8 months ago, and the trademark dispute was the only reason they delayed. But somehow, with 9 months more development, it wasn't ready to launch without what is essentially an alpha tag and discounted price. Just another question that would go unanswered, except for the obvious, the game was never ready, and early access could shield them from some criticism if things were not perfect. So this left another question to be asked. With the game now being a month away and having a perfect opportunity for a beta test, were they going to have one? But there was simply no mention of this. IGN fortunately was paying attention, and with a direct line to Fantastic, they asked the question, where was the beta? Fantastic's response would have been much better had they simply ignored the question entirely. Instead, they said that the beta was still happening, but there was only for Fantastic volunteers. If you remember back, volunteers are what they call not only their full-time employees, but also the people who do their unpaid work such as moderation. So this was clearly a ridiculous thing to do and say, especially after they'd gone out of their way, without prompt, to quiet public criticism by promising this beta. They made no further attempt to clarify the situation, not with IGN, and not publicly to their audience, who they told directly to expect the ability to play the beta, but also that they wanted them to play it, to give them feedback and improve the game prior to launch. What this essentially means, reading between the lines, is that they valued secrecy of their game state more than they did any chance to make improvements to the product. That they were scared to show what they had, and that they were happy to pretend they never mentioned a beta to their fans, instead saying the only people who could play in this beta were people who already had access to the game, or were, according to my own experience, under non-disclosure agreements preventing them from sharing their experience. To be clear here, if nothing else had happened, if this video was 1 minute long, there was no additional context, this one decision from Fantastic would have given you everything you needed to suspect that this game launch was going to be a disaster, to declare that the development studio was rotten and that they were not to be trusted under any circumstance, that this launch was going to be fireworks for all the wrong reasons. And that was true. Fast forward to December 4th, just 3 days before the big finale, and Fantastic again took to Twitter to reveal their truth. This letter was well received, much more than anything they had posted previously, and essentially just says they love their game.